Good morning, friends. I don't think any of us watched the footage of George Floyd being held down by that policeman, saying the words, "I can't breathe," and didn't feel a sense of deep shame, of hurt, and of shock. Many of you will know that George was actually a street pastor. He worked in Houston. He worked very hard to help those in very poor conditions. So his death, for many, seemed even more shocking. But then we had the protest. People came out on the streets. They defied the coronavirus to protest, to say that Black lives mattered. One of those protesters I was listening to said that white people are going to have no idea what it's like to be a Black person, to have their whole life judged by the colour of their skin. Well, I can. Back in 1994-5, I went to Haiti. I was covering the American blockade and later invasion of the country. And I was there with a Black film crew filming for a documentary. During our time there, we went up into the mountains and we went to interview some people. We went to a small village of about 300 people. And when we arrived there to film, I very quickly realised I was the only white person there. As I walked through the streets, I was acutely aware that people were looking at me because of my colour, because I differed visually from them, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. I felt uncomfortable. I felt embarrassed. I wanted to hide my face, my arms, my legs, and I couldn't. I could do nothing about the fact that I was white and everyone else was Black. And at that point in Haiti, there was a huge anger and resentment of anyone who was white. And therefore, as I walked through the streets and as I talked to people, I felt all their anger, all their fear projected on me because of the colour of my skin. Now in Haiti, that anger, that resentment goes right the way back to the slave trade. And of course, we've seen ourselves in Bristol. We've seen how Edward Colston's statue was thrown into the Bristol docks because of the anger of slavery. And whether we agree with that action or not, we can't help but understand why people would fear a return to any form of discrimination on those levels. That will never ever happen, but people have that legacy, that history that goes back so far. It struck me looking at the statue, hearing people talk, remembering my own experience of just how dreadful slavery was. And I have another link to slavery, one that I'm actually incredibly proud of. My 5 times great grandfather was William Wilberforce, one of the campaigners, the man who led in Parliament to actually abolish the slave trade. So I feel a very personal connection on a completely other level to what's going on at the moment, to why I believe Black lives matter so much. But it also struck me about someone else who cared a lot about Black lives, although to start with, no one would have believed that was the case. A man called John Newton. John was press-ganged as a young man into being in the British Navy, and he ended up on slave boats. On one occasion, he was in a huge storm just off the Irish coast. He feared for his life and the life of everyone else on the boat. He also put out a prayer. He prayed to God to save him, and he prayed that if God would save him, then he would devote his life to God. Well, the ship was saved. John was saved. But as with so many of us, we make that promise to God, and then what do? We sit God down in a comfy chair, and we go off and do something else, ask him to wait for us, metaphorically give him a cup of tea, and we say we'll be back. And John was the same. John went off, he carried on in his career, and in fact he worked very closely in the slave trade. And it was only later in his life, after he had a stroke, that he had time to assess what had happened. He fought very hard to go into the church. He felt certainly called to be a priest, and it took a long time to convince people that he should be. but he got there. He became a priest. And I believe he was quite a good priest, in fact. But the thing that John Newton is most remembered for is writing the words to one amazing hymn, and that hymn is Amazing Grace. And today, I think with everything that's going on, sometimes it is worth us just simply remembering God's amazing grace. Jesus didn't discriminate with anyone that he called to his side. Jesus told us that where anyone was in prison, when anyone was discriminated against, he would be there. Remember the story with the disciples? When were we with you, Lord? And he said, when I was in prison, when I was suffering, when I was hungry. God's amazing grace means that Jesus understands those who are suffering, whether that suffering is through the present coronavirus epidemic or whether that suffering is centuries-old discrimination because of the colour of their face, because of the colour of their skin. And so I hope that as we go through the rest of our week, as we travel to a time when we can go back into our churches, hopefully, and pray privately, that prayer will be for God's amazing grace to cover our whole country, to cover our whole world, that we and everyone may know, just as George Floyd knew, God's amazing grace. Amen.